This is Keys to the Shop, episode 436, How to Make Your Work Effortless, with Greg McKeown. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DiFirio. I am your host for the show. Really excited to have you along for today's episode as we welcome back a guest from the show back in 2020, Greg McKeown, talking about this new book, Effortless. It is really a fantastic philosophy and concept. I think it's going to do a lot of good for you. So really awesome episode in store. Now, if you like these types of episodes, if you love what Keys to the Shop does, I would encourage you to subscribe to the show. Stay updated by being subscribed. It'll let you know when new episodes come out. Also, rate and review this show. If you are enjoying the content, give us a 5-star rating or even write a short review of the show and recommend it to other people there on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, or you could even share these episodes on social media and to your team and your email list. All of the above really helps Keys to the Shop, and the word gets out about the resource that this show provides to the specialty retail community. So thank you everyone for doing that. Now, something I'm really excited about is that we have launched our first group. It is called the Key Holder Coaching Group. It is a small group of coffee shop owners who are all dedicated to each other's success, hosted by myself. These sessions last for 6 months, 2 hours every 2 weeks, and we are collaborating together to help each other succeed in specialty coffee retail. The first couple of meetings have been so great, and I'm glad that we started these key holder coaching groups. The next round of groups, and it will be groups, it'll be 2 groups instead of just 1, which it is right now, is going to be happening in the spring of 2024. If you want to be considered for that and be notified when we open up the next one for applications, then go ahead and email Chris at keystotheshop.com, CHRIS at keystotheshop.com. You could also reach out on direct message at Instagram at keystotheshop. But these are life-changing conversations, and everyone in these groups is already reaping a lot of benefit. So I'm grateful and hope maybe to see you in these groups starting in 2024 is the next round. So go ahead and email Chris at keystotheshop.com for both that, and if you're interested in Keys to the Shop consulting and coaching, I can work one-on-one with you and your team as well to help you find joy, freedom, profitability, and success in specialty coffee. So go ahead and email Chris at keystotheshop.com. So I'm really excited about a new brewer, and it is the new ground control brewer from Voga Coffee. You know, the ground control Cyclops brewer we're talking about on the show as being this technology that revolutionizes extraction potential for both batch brew coffee as well as batching espresso and batched iced lattes and beyond in tea. This machine has been changing lives all over the world and upending people's expectations. Well, now this new brewer is 45% less in terms of cost than the Cyclops brewer with Ground Control's Early Bird Special. It's much shorter in height as well, so this is more versatile on your bar. Plus, there is 30% higher volume for batch espresso and cold brew concentrates, and the technology is now cloud connected to a smart dispenser that tracks all your brewing data. So the Ground Control has just gotten better, more compact, with more power. It is really amazing. So go ahead and check them out at groundcontrol.coffee for more information. Awesome brewer and amazing technology that helps your coffee really shine. Again, groundcontrol.coffee. Your customers are going to be choosing not just regular dairy, but they're going to be choosing plant-based beverages very frequently. And as we select our coffees and the blends that we make in the cafe, they rely on us to select the right types of milks and the right types of plant-based beverages to go with those coffees. If you're looking for the best in plant-based beverages, I think the Barista series from Pacific is something you should take a real good look at. This is the line of plant-based performance beverages designed for baristas. It is tested by some of the world's best baristas before any of their extensive lineup ever makes it out into the marketplace. This is why it stands up to the heat from steaming, performs amazingly with great texture for latte art, and also it keeps the flavor balance focused on the coffee. So all of this adds up to one amazing product. Go check them out at pacificfoodservice.com. Get samples in your store today and try it for yourself. If you're looking for the best plant-based beverages for your customers, then I think it has to be the Barista series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today we are going to be talking with author Greg McKeown back on the show. We had the honor to have Greg on the show in 2020 talking about his book, Essentialism. And now he is back. And now he's got a new book called Effortless. Now, Greg McKeown, if you're not familiar, has dedicated his professional life to uncovering counterintuitive ways to be very successful without burning out. In this pursuit, he's written 2 New York Times bestsellers, the one I just mentioned, Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less, which has sold over 1 million copies and has been voted as Goodreads' #1 leadership and success book to read in a lifetime. And the book that we are talking about today, Effortless, Make It Easier to Do What Matters Most. And both these books have been published in 37 languages. This is phenomenal. Greg himself is an exceptional public speaker and has spoken to hundreds of audiences around the world, 40 countries, companies including Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Nike, TED Fellows, South by Southwest, just to name a few, and by personal invitation of the Crown Prince of Norway at his annual innovation conference. He is the host of the Greg McKeown podcast, which has been ranked in the top 5 of all self-help improvement podcasts and top 10 of all educational podcasts. His work has been covered in print media, including The New Yorker, New York Times, Time Magazine, Fast Company, Fortune, Politico, and the Harvard Business Review, and has been covered on many nationally syndicated television shows and talk shows. McKeown also served for 7 years as a board member for Washington, D.C. policy group Resolve, as a mentor with 2 Seeds, a nonprofit incubator for agricultural projects in Africa, and has also been a speaker at nonprofit groups including the Kauffman Fellows, Net Impact, and Stanford University. And so, like I said, it is an honor to have Greg back on the show to talk to us in the specialty coffee retail community about this idea of effortless, about making it easier to do what matters most. And this conversation is full of great examples from the book as well as from Greg's life that illustrate the concept of making the work we do effortless and really in service of avoiding burnout in our work's pursuits. We're going to talk about what it means to make work effortless, how to take the first steps into making that a reality in our cafes, and also how to help the people we work with do the same thing. This is going to be counterintuitive in some ways to what we've been taught about hustle culture and grinding and other maybe toxic concepts about hard work. And I hope gives us permission to find innovative ways to produce results in an effortless way that in turn create impact and fuel our lives and our businesses. And so let's get right to it. I'm really excited for you to listen to this conversation. Here now is my interview with the author of the book, Effortless, Greg McKeown. Well, Greg, welcome back to Keys to the Shop. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Chris, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
You know, we had you on the show way back in 2020, and it was such an interesting time to have a conversation about Essentialism, which is the book that we were talking about on that episode, because it was so appropriate for so many people. And this just feels like a continuation, the idea of effortless. What led you to write this book? And is it something specifically for what you've observed happening in society today?
Yes, it is. I think that people listening to this, watching this, know just exactly what I'm talking about when I say that life is often suffering, and that maybe most people live in a form of suffering most of the time. And when we don't think of someone else as suffering, it's generally because we just don't know them well enough. They're not open with what they're struggling with. And in addition to that, you have this modern world that so often adds additional complexity, all these ways in which we make life harder than it needs to be. And that's a pretty good launch pad for our conversation, is that people can just ask themselves that question. How am I making life harder than it needs to be right now? Because that's the territory we can do something about.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea that the world makes things more complex is like we are the world. Not to be like, yeah, 80s moment in music here, but we do contribute to the masses of individual decisions to make things needlessly complex, I suppose. And in coffee and in food service and in any customer facing role, it gets more complex because it's not just a task in yourself that you're managing, it's other people, your customers and your staff. And so this feels super appropriate for where we find ourselves in coffee shops, especially. We do tend to think, though, that we have to muscle through things. And this is something you bring up in the book. So when things get hard, when things get tough, the tough get tougher type of mentality. And why is it wrong for us to think that this is just the way we have to do things when things get hard?
Well, there's a 10x dilemma for these business owners that you're working with. Like, you could ask everybody, could reflect right now and say, do I want to achieve 10x results, right? Like figuratively, something like much better results. And everybody's going to say yes to that. That's why they're listening. That's why they're investing in themselves right now and in your podcast, in your show. If you ask a second question, well, who can work 10x harder? Can you work 10 times harder than you work right now? We'll have a deafening silence. That's not the problem. You have a whole audience of insecure overachievers. They're trying to achieve. They're trying to get to the next level. And so when you run out of space and then you say, well, there's nothing I can do but just to try to work 10 times harder to get 10 times results, well, you don't get 10x results. You just burn out before you get to the next level. And so what Effortless is all about is strategies and tools that people can use right now to be able to break through to that next level, but without burning out. So that's the target audience. And that, to me, at least, is the solution. When you can't work any harder, you have to find a better, smarter approach.
There is a necessary effort that we have to put in to even being effortless, of course. So the whole idea is that we're making the right investment into the things that require certain things, but we're not making it harder than it has to be. You saying this is good, and we're like, yeah, maybe he's right, but we still don't trust you,
Yeah, that's right. And the reason is really simple, and that is because part of the way in which we've made things harder than they need to be is to absorb, let's say, a sort of bad 1980s motivational speaker. Maybe it was in the form of a coach. It could be in the form of a parent. It could be in other ways. But we've adopted this idea that maximum effort equals maximum results. And as soon as I say it, it feels like, well, I think that's probably right. Like I'm sure people, yeah, I think that's probably how the world works, but it's not how it works. What we need instead is optimal effort that produces maximum results. I just wrote an article for Harvard Business Review that's become a bit of a viral moment. It's about the 85% rule. And the idea is if you want a high-performing team, you apply the 85% rule. And if you allow it, there's an illustration of this that I think is really helpful to try to challenge our own assumptions about how the world works. Does it work if we go down this path?
Well, let's go down the path.
So go with me to the 1850s, when it's the great age of exploration. And of course, it's a long time before the moonshot, but the equivalent of the moonshot at the time was get to the South Pole, because nobody in all of recorded history had ever done it. And lots of people had been trying and failing, but then you suddenly have these two teams, one from Great Britain, one from Norway. They set off at the same time, and it's a race for the poles. Who will make it first? It's from two different locations, so they can't see each other. This is the closest anyone's going to get, and maybe it will finally be broken, this impossible, physically arduous journey. The first team is led by the British captain, and his whole idea is, as I described it, maximum effort equals maximum results. What does that translate to? It's like, well, day one, if you can, you go 30, 40, even 50 miles if you possibly can, on the logic that this strategy will get you to the South Pole faster than the other team. But what they created without intending to was a boom and bust approach to execution. So on the days they're going maximum distance, it feels good, but then they're burning themselves out to such a degree that when they get to the bad weather days, they can make not an inch of progress. And that means that they then are hunkered down in their tents. They're just trying to survive. All they can think about is their exhaustion and the fact they're making no progress. So they're just writing in their journals, oh, could anybody make progress in weather like this? Well, one team could, and that was the Norwegian team. He was referred to as the last Viking. And his idea was different. He said, we need optimal effort to produce maximum results. And what that meant was very specifically 15 miles a day. And he'd learned it by working with the indigenous Eskimos of the time who had taught him that what you have to monitor for is how much you sweat. You've got to reduce the amount of sweat to be able to survive the extreme weather conditions that you're in. And so he translated that to this 15 miles a day. Well, day one, they can go way further than 15 miles, but they don't. Same for day 2, day 3, and so on. And it continues this way. First bad weather day, 15. This is the consistent path. And so they're making meaningful progress day after day. Well, the plot thickens when the Norwegian team gets within 45 miles of the South Pole with perfect weather conditions and perfect sledding conditions. In a single push, if they break their rule, they can get there within one day. And to make it even tougher, they don't know where the British team is. So for all they know, the British team is ahead of them. So what do we do? Everybody listening to this can think about that. Would they push or pace? And if they're honest, certainly if I'm honest, I'd say push. Violate the rule, just get there, because this has got to be the way to be faster. But he doesn't. He maintains that rule. He takes 3 more days, averaging 15 miles a day, till he gets to the South Pole. They arrive at the South Pole, the first team to ever do that in ever. They have beaten the British team by more than 20 days.
Wow.
Now, that's not what should happen. Not if the bad 1980s motivational speaker is right. That's not what should happen. They should have been slower than the other team. But this goes to the heart of what I've learned in the research for this book. This is why the 85% rule matters so much to me. And there's one more piece to the story, because not only did they arrive sooner, they also had the energy and the strategy to be able to make the 16,000-mile journey back to Norway, which is a non-trivial problem to have, especially considering that the British team who did make it to the South Pole, but 20 plus days later, not one of them survived the journey home, because this approach is so suboptimal, despite the conviction that insecure overachievers have around this idea. It's completely unsustainable, and literally so in their case. When I read the biography about this whole account, there was a phrase that shot off the page, almost knocked me off my chair. The biographer, describing the approach of the Norwegian team, said that every day they made progress, here's the exact phrase, without particular effort. It's an outrageous thing to write. It's the most physically arduous thing that people could imagine. And nevertheless, those are the words he used to describe it. There's something in that story, something in the extremity of the story that I think should help us to reimagine what actually produces high performance over time. And that is the 85% rule.
Wow. That is an incredible story and tragic. And the idea that they beat them by so much is indicative of so many businesses, I feel, that have I would say a patience almost with how growth happens. If that fits, I'm not sure if that fits, but the idea that we're insecure is one idea that is absolutely there. But I keep giving this idea that we're not patient enough with what we have on our hands or curious enough about it. We maybe are a little assumptive and impatient and we subvert all of our effort by being impatient.
Yes, adopt that word impatient, because what I think drives the impatience is a lack of belief or faith that results will come eventually if we're doing the right things today. And so it's that idea of sort of pulling up the roses to see how the roots are doing. You violate something because you can't bear to wait. You don't believe it will work. But the cost of it, just think about it, right? Somebody starts off with great enthusiasm. They start their shop, they get their team, but they have burning out the culture of the team almost from the first second they have them. And so then, of course, the turnover is higher. And then, of course, if your turnover is higher, then you're more frustrated because you're having to fix it. The culture in your group, of course, then continues to deteriorate, becomes more toxic. This affects your customer outreach. I mean, it's a whole cycle that's built in an idea that is completely false. This idea of 110% effort, like whatever that means, is as wrong as it can be. All you're doing is robbing the future of the resources you'll need. And so the better approach is to say, look, how do I live today? Of course, we're talking about as a high performance, but that's why I think 85% is such a nice rule of thumb. It's like, no, we've got to give and be engaged, but we need to leave some in the tank for tomorrow. And that simple idea means that you can keep going for 3 months, 6 months, 5 years, 10 years when everybody else has given up. I mean, that consistency is one way to beat your competitors anyway. Just think about podcasting. I heard a statistic, I don't know if it's for sure true, but that like 80% of podcasts don't make it past the third episode. And then of those that remain, another 80% don't make it through to the 20th episode. So you can see that just consistently going, you're actually beating the vast majority of your competitors just by consistently going.
It is hard for us to accept, but we do see it in the form of other businesses when we look at their success, but we see just the tip of the iceberg. And it's that classic no overnight success. It's always a lot of hard work that you don't see. And when we're impatient, we want to see the result so that we can prove that the loan we took out for the business was actually worth it. And we want that to be proven really soon. So how do you advise business owners who are in this risky situation where they have a lot on the line and especially emotionally attached to this reality to just adopt a little bit more of a slower growth and have faith that it's going to work out? I mean, where do they even start when it comes to practical application of this philosophy in their business?
Well, look, what we're talking about is a risk reduction strategy. That's a really important idea. Like, let's use the Hebrew Bible story of Joseph in Egypt as an illustration, right? So he's there. We don't have to go all the background, but the king has a vision and is a dream and of these 7 cows that are fat, and then they eat these 7 other cows that are skinny. And the metaphor behind it gets interpreted by Joseph. And he says, well, look, what it means is you're going to have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. So through the years of plenty, they store up all of this abundance so that they can survive through the years that are rough, that are coming. And so that simple idea of creating buffer now, when we have the energy for whatever the unexpected thing is that's coming, is a really important entrepreneurial tool for resilience. If you maximize all your efforts so that you are not just burning out your energy for today, your mental capacity for today, but you're also diving into your deep reserves to get through today. And you're in red brain, let's say half of the day even, that feeling red brain when you're just maxed out. And so you're not thinking clearly and it's painful. You are using up tomorrow's resources, sometimes next week's, next month's, all combined, and you have no idea what the challenge is going to be. There will be challenges, there will be unexpected problems, and you are putting yourself in the highest risk state with which to handle whatever those challenges are going to be. So what can people do about it? I mean, there's all sorts of practical applications to the 85% rule, but one of them is to have an upper bound and a lower bound. In the example with the race to the polls, okay, so the upper and lower bound was almost exactly the same, 15 miles, even in bad days. But in our own efforts, we can have a similar approach where you say, for example, let's say this, use a planning mechanism called the 1-2-3 method, where every day as an entrepreneur, you can write down what is one essential thing I need to do today, the most important project I need to work on. But sometimes I think the rule of thumb of 2 or 3 hours on that thing might be appropriate. Then underneath it, the two is two things that are essential and urgent. Okay, we know what that is. Those are things that by definition, they're important and the deadline is upon you. And then the third thing is three maintenance items. And that's often missed even by people that are into planning and into efficiency and productivity, because these are the things that, although they don't feel important today, if you don't do them, they will make your life harder later than they need to be. So let's say you organize that before you've checked your phone, before you've checked email, you take that time to be able to get clear about it, before you get pulled into the noise of the day. Then you also have that as your done for the day list. That is, you don't just keep adding and adding and adding all through the day, and then it gets to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, and you just still think, well, I've got to do more. No, you have a done for the day list and a done for the day time, so that you have enough to restore, so that when you hit tomorrow, you don't just have full energy, which is great, but you also are in a mental state with which to better discern what to focus on and what not to focus on.
So you in the book talk about knowing what done looks like. That idea that you just talked about, we just actually talked about defining excellence and success so that we can at least know that we've accomplished something instead of constantly moving the goalpost every single day. And that feels satisfying to you and your team. And it feels similar in that you as the operator especially have this 30,000 foot view of the entire business. And the worst thing you could probably do is keep the entire business and all of its details in front of you every single day, 24 hours a day. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because we don't give ourselves permission to, I wouldn't even say unplug, but that's what it feels like. It feels like if we step away, disaster is going to strike. It's just waiting. The negative is just waiting at the door, but we never assume the positive, do we?
Yeah, I really like that. And it also pulls me into this other distinction. So the final third of the book is, in some ways, my favorite section of all of the research that I did. And it's the difference between thinking about we know about ROI, our return on investment, but what about our return on effort? And there's one way of approaching results that's, let's say, linear results. That is, I wake up today, I do this thing, and I get this result. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. And there's lots of things that are like that. But if we're not careful as an entrepreneur, everything becomes like that. And so if we don't do it today, then the whole thing is going to collapse. And there's a different mindset shift where we really move to residual results in our thinking. So we say, well, it might take even a little more effort up front in order to build a system that works for us. And that is where all the magic happens in entrepreneurship and in life more generally. So, for example, a friend of mine, Jessica Jakely, she went with her then husband and a team of people. They were students. They went to Africa. They wanted to try to make a difference there. While they're there, they get taught in the idea by Muhammad Yunus about how to help entrepreneurs through microloans. Well, they find an entrepreneur. They don't have much money themselves, but they realize when they're talking to her that she's so stuck in this linear mindset. She's selling produce on the road. Any day that she doesn't sell that produce, she cannot feed her children and she cannot feed herself. So she's in a completely understandable stuck in this model. And they said, well, how much would it cost to help you to start thinking more residually, where you get results that start to flow to you? And she said, they kind of made a plan together. And she said, well, look, for $500, I'd be able to stop the work for enough time to go and renegotiate, cut out the middleman, negotiate with the people who are actually sending me the produce, and that this would help me permanently get ahead every day rather than always maintaining my stuck position. Well, they're about to give her the $500, and then they think about this Yunus idea, and they say, well, what if we did it as a loan? Then suddenly we would be able to achieve, let's say, 10x results, because she repays the loan and another person can help, and so on. So that's a 10x result for almost no more effort, just a different way of thinking. But then they said, well, hold on, what if we could leverage that idea again, and we make a platform, a website that allows other people to provide these microloans? And this is how Kiva.org was born. I think it's at $1.4 billion now. I think that's about the number of loans with a 97% repayment rate, which is sort of incredible and unthinkable because banks presumed all the time and for the history of humankind that an extreme poor would not repay loans. And so you could see how the cycle of extreme poverty continues. Well, that's the power of shifting your mindset from linear results into residual results. You can build a system that works for you in many, many ways. And so it's the key, I think, is to try to use that essential item in your 1, 2, 3 method to be working on something that will work for you afterwards. For me, it's writing. That's an example. Every day that I write, I am writing a residual result into my future. It's not an easy part of my life particularly, but that's the work that will, Essentialism and Effortless have gone to 37 languages now, write millions of copies. And it's like, that's the power of residual entrepreneurship, where results are flowing to you again and again and again.
When you talk about that example with Kiva, it makes me think about the people needed to be there in order to observe what was necessary to create in the system. And part of what you talk about is observation and being able to see clearly. There's some obvious next steps that you talk about that take the next obvious step. But you need to be there to know what that step is. And so I could write a bunch of things on my list, right? But what is the right thing would require a little bit of curiosity and an investigation into what is, in our minds, this kind of a boogeyman of tangled commitments and confusions. So how do we take that step to actually be there, observe, see clearly, in order to know that when we make these next steps, they're the right ones?
The difference between living life and thinking about life, right? The difference between doing entrepreneurship and looking at yourself as an entrepreneur, working in your business versus working on your business, right? Those are all different ways of saying the same thing, is a game changer. You don't move into residual results until you take that shift, because you'll be consumed in the noise of today. And so literally just the idea of saying, okay, I'm going to take a portion of my time, not in the back office working on paperwork, but just observing my business, going and seeing people, talking to some customers, talking to the employees, and just listening. Not trying to fix anything right now, just listening is, to me, hugely underrated leadership. I was going to say skill, but I want to say more than that, like foundation for everything else. Think for a moment about Satya Nadella. So this is new research I'm working on right now for a new book that I'm writing, so a little glimpse. But Satya Nadella gets to become CEO a little surprisingly. When he was told, you're going to be the CEO, he said, well, if you want me to be. So he's really unusual temperament for a CEO of Microsoft. There's only been 3 CEOs, and he stands in tremendous contrast in style and communication approach to the previous 2, especially the 10 years previous under Ballmer. I'm not knocking Ballmer to make that observation. I have a podcast. I just interviewed the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, and asked him all about the differences between those 3 leaders. And he described that when Satya came into their first executive meeting, he brought a copy of Nonviolent Communication with him, which is an excellent book. But you can see why that's a culture shift. This is a company that was not just a reputation for, but literally was typical that someone would be yelling at a meeting, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. This was typical and normalized in that executive team and elsewhere. So Satya comes in and he seeks to change the culture. One of the things that he did is he just started calling lots of people within the organization. And there's a story of 2 people that were new to the business, and so they're pretty junior. And he calls them up, and for half an hour, he just asks questions. There wasn't a single opinion given. He didn't tell them what he needed from them. He didn't say, look, this is my expectation. He's listening. Well, how are you finding Microsoft? And what do you think we should change? And what do you think is working? If you had magic wand, what would you do next? And he said that this approach was the most important single thing he did because it became the foundation of all of the changes that he went on to make because the changes were relevant. And so when we say, do the next step, do what's the first step in a process? Well, it's not just what's a step, it's the right next step. And the difference is all about the degree to which you're listening accurately to what's going on with your employees and with your business. That is a total game changer. Without it, you end up making the wrong decision, addressing the wrong issue, and therefore, of course, getting the wrong result, even though your motives were good the whole time. It's a serious risk, but it's also a serious benefit.
That's wonderful. We've had a guest on the show a couple times, Oscar Trimbley of Deep Listening. And it kind of falls in line with this idea that we can hear things just fine. In fact, we adopt things oftentimes at a surface level, but we don't actually hear what's not being said and pick up on what's being communicated. And throughout the year, this year and other years, I go to clients' places, coffee shops, and that's what we do is listen and watch and observe and just amass a lot of information. And the theme emerges. And if you are just tuned in, it's a bit of a leap of faith in some ways that your brain, and I've heard this before, and maybe you've heard a little bit more about this, but the brain is basically an organizing machine, and it creates meaning out of data. And if you feel like, well, I'm not going to get anywhere just by observing it, it feels like your brain is basically doing the work and it's not telling you until until it just kind of comes together. Oh, that's what that is.
Yes.
Or I didn't know people felt that way. Does that seem true?
Well, completely. And so it's all about this. Let's say it begins with using the 5-second rule for shelving your agenda. So many people, when they're listening with which to agree or to disagree. And so they're not really absorbing much new information. They're just trying to work out how what somebody is saying, how it hits their pre-existing view of the world. And so the biggest obstacle with this kind of game-changing listening is that people are stuck in their heads. And it's easy to see why this would be the case, partially because it's an overwhelming world in which we live and there's so much noise, but also because if you can maintain the mindset that you have inside of your head, you don't have to change anything. You don't have to improve, you don't have to grow, you don't have to throw anything out, you don't have to be wrong in the past. You can always be right, not just now, but in the past as well. So there's a significant incentive to help people stay stuck in their heads, to not be interested at all in information that would challenge or get them to have to upgrade the OS that's running their system. But of course, the downside is serious, right? Because as soon as you're not listening to new information that challenges what you think so that you can upgrade what the OS of your life, then you become irrelevant. And it can happen slowly so that this, from a personal point of view, this is, I think, how it happens that people after 20 years of being married suddenly wake up and, my goodness, we need to be divorced, and it's sort of sudden. Well, it's not sudden. It's that they became more and more irrelevant to each other. They're making efforts to do things, but they're probably the wrong things now. They're addressing the wrong issues. And so it doesn't matter. Your motive does not matter. Your talent does not matter. Your intelligence does not matter. If all of that is addressing the wrong issue, then everything else, it's like in mathematics where you take any number, however large, and you multiply it by 0, you still get 0. That's what happens when people are not listening to what really is going on. They will then address the wrong issue and everything goes to naught.
That is very well put. I don't know, you might tell me who the saying is. The very worst thing in the world is to be very good and skilled at something that need not be done at all.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, there's a lot of people that have said things like that. Drucker said something, almost verbatim for that. But yeah, I think he says there's nothing so pointless as efficiently doing that which should not be done at all.
Yes.
But the thing is that most people will listen to that quote and go, yeah, I agree. But they don't make the connection between that and this advanced, powerful yes, empathic, but also more than empathic, insightful form of listening. They have not made the connection. I mean, most people think about productivity as very individual sport. But of course, almost everything in our lives is interpersonal. It's an interdependent reality. And so as soon as you bring that into the mental model, you say, well, I have to be listening, and not just not passively listening, not listening in a way that people are talking and you're bored out of your minds. If that's happening, it's not on them. It's on you as a leader.
Yes.
One of the best listeners. In fact, I think it is from nonviolent communication. So here he is, one of the most advanced listeners at the time in the world. He's passed away now. But he said, the moment you're bored in a conversation, you should be interrupting it, which is interesting. It's not what we think of. You think of listening as being very, oh, yes, you don't never interrupt. But he says the moment you're bored, the moment you're not like connecting with them, you need to interrupt and go, okay, because what's happening, the reason you're bored is that they're not talking about what's alive in them. That's his language for it. What they're doing is they're regurgitating a story they've told many times, or something they've told you many times, or they're giving you peripheral details about something. If you're listening to the jugular issues, if you're listening to the things that matter and are essential, you're never, ever bored. Ever. It's the most stimulating, powerful connection. If you get out of your head and into the world of another, there is nothing richer that I have experienced in my whole lifetime. Not in all the travel, not in all the work, not in all the organizations I've had the chance to work with. You will never be more interested than when you're inside of the world of another, where they're talking about something that actually matters to them. And so every time you're not in that state, it's your fault. Really. The people that you meet along the way, everyone has interesting stories and rich value. It's just that we're at the periphery where it's safe and boring and non-essential.
It's a team effort. And this idea that we're going it alone that you just mentioned, where this is an interconnected world that we live in. And certainly in a coffee shop and in almost every profession, you work with people in some capacity. And the idea of being effortless seems impossible if it's all up to you. And this idea that you are going to be bored by listening to somebody may also be something to do with what you talk about as essential, as the engine of business, which is trust. Now, if I trust the doctor that I'm listening to and they tell me something that I do or don't want to hear, I will believe them either way because I trust them. But otherwise, it's just, oh, that's interesting, but I don't really trust them. So I guess we would have to start by trusting the people that are with us in the effort.
Well, the idea is that you want two sides to this trust equation. You want to be able to trust people completely. That is, have a high trust agreement with them. So you're not micromanaging and so on. But the only way to do that is to actually hire people you trust in the first place. And so that's an example of where if we're just reacting to the situation, okay, hire anyone. My goodness, we need someone. It's a terrible situation. And we're just reacting, and you hire someone that you don't really trust. And there's a sort of 2 or 3 ways that you can think about trust, right? Warren Buffett puts it this way. He says, well, I think about it, I call it the 3 I's, but it's his words. He says, you need someone that has integrity, you have someone who has intelligence, and someone who has initiative. And of course, ideally, what you want is 9 or 10 out of 10 on those 3 criteria. And integrity is the most important, he points out, because without it, then the other 2 can hurt you.
Right.
Okay, so now what does that look like for him? So Warren Buffett, here we have the most successful investor in modern history, maybe ever. He's decided he wants to buy a firm for $21 billion. It's McKeown Industries, and they're buying it from Walmart. Now, I mean, none of us have bought a $21 billion business, so we don't know exactly what that's like, but we can easily imagine how many months of work you would expect just for due diligence between a whole team, a mini army of lawyers, to go through all of the contracts, to go through all of the statements of fact that are being made, millions of dollars invested there, let's say over half a year, which is what made what happened on that agreement so shocking. It was done in a 2-hour meeting and a handshake. And the reason that it was done like that is that Buffett said, we knew that Walmart would have everything exactly as they said that they would, and they did. That's just this tangible illustration of what happens if you're working with somebody that you have that level of trust with. But then it's not just this was an exception. This is the whole core of Buffett's strategy. I mean, it's really at the very, the heartbeat of his business is that he says, we're not looking for like just good people. We're saying no all day long. We're just reading proposal after proposal after proposal until they find one that's a definitive yes. One of the reasons they know it's a yes is it's managed by the best managers in the world. And so then, like he says, what are we going to tell them what to do after we've working with the people who are better than anybody else? He says we invest in people we trust completely, and we trust them completely. So that their investment strategy, this is his language for this. Think of how crazy this is. He says our investment strategy borders on lethargy. So you got to think about that. And you've got to contrast that with this make-believe 1980s motivational speaker that I'm referencing through this conversation, because those do not agree. Buffett does not agree. And he's not saying be lazy. Of course, he's not saying be lazy, but easy is not the same as lazy. Lazy is that you're not willing to put in the effort. Easy is that you don't need to put in the effort. So you can use that effort, that limited resources of effort, to do something else, like build your business system so that it's giving you production even when you're not putting in effort.
It's the aiming, it feels like, that you're taking the time to aim your efforts in the right direction and that it has an outsized impact on the results versus scattershot attempts at this way or that way. And approaching things with doubt will never lead you to a satisfactory answer. So if you doubt somebody, it feels like you would never be happy, even if they were successful, because you would doubt even their success. As a team member, they could be great people, and certainly we've lost great people as team members in businesses because they were trustworthy. It's just that we ourselves couldn't get over the hump to extend trust to them.
Yes, so I think that this goes back to this idea of the two sides of the trust coin, right? On the one hand, you hire the right people so that it's easier to trust them to do the work. And the other side is that it is clearly possible to hire high trust people and then not to trust them completely and to then strangle the life out of them because you're micromanaging somebody who is capable of far more than they're currently doing. What we need in that situation is a high trust agreement. And this is also part of the trust chapter in Effortless, where you're really identifying in writing, what is the result we're trying to achieve? What are the things we don't want to be done? Like, what are any of the rules of the road? And when will we be holding each other accountable? And what will the reward be? What will the consequences be? What are the natural consequences of performance and non-performance? And so you take that all out of guesswork. You take it all out of this painfully capricious form of management where people are constantly just wondering when the next problem will happen and when the person will suddenly say, well, this is terrible and I don't like it, or berate you for something it wasn't even clear to you. And all of this awfulness that destroys trust for employees and then, of course, for managers as well and gets you on this downward cycle. A high trust agreement in writing, it doesn't have to be a legally binding contract. It's a contract of expectations, and they're so clear that they then become the beginning of empowerment for everybody involved.
We know where we stand, and there's so many people that don't even have job descriptions for positions, and expectations are kept in the head. And it's just, did I not tell you that? Oh, I'm sorry, I did, and I'm really disappointed in you, by the way.
Oh, it happened to me today. A failure in my part. So somebody, it's not in my core business, but somebody that, remember we talked about it this way. And of course, I don't remember if we talked about it that way. Maybe that's how they remember it, or maybe we did, or maybe we didn't, but we didn't get it to writing. And that's it takes a little more effort up front to get things in writing. But then, of course, it pays dividends down the road where you have a version of truth you both agreed to. And so that starts to govern the relationship over just whatever my fallible memory is or their fallible memory is. It really makes a big difference, and it's an example of this residual result. A little more effort up front, but then the agreement starts to help you day after day to be able to operate in a high trust way with each other.
And what you're doing is, you are still the boss and you have a responsibility to serve people through your work. You're teaching as well. And you mentioned how teaching is so important for you to learn. And now that you're clear, we're all clear on where we stand. Here's what you're doing. Here's what I'm doing. Here's who I am in relation to you, etc. It feels like that's the kind of environment where the organization can learn and not just an individual.
Yeah, well, certainly. The idea of a leader as a teacher is certainly not a new idea, but it's something we have to sort of remind ourselves about because so much of modern management is a reactive experience. You can't have a conversation about this without also referencing where modern management really began. So of course, modern management is an industrial phenomenon.
Yeah.
Before the Industrial Revolution, which of course massively improved quality of life overall for everybody in an industrialized country. Massively, like way more than is given its due.
Agreed.
50 times, right? Increased productivity 50 times. Massively changed the circumstances. Before the Industrial Revolution, survival was so tough and the choices available to people were so few. It's almost unrecognizable to us to try to even get our heads back into what life was in that environment. Nevertheless, it worked so well that it became an unquestioned dominant assumption. The factory-based model will change everything. And I think it's easy to forgive the people that made that assumption because it was so transformative. But suddenly schools were built in the model of the industrial age. They look like factories. To this day, they're divided by subject. People sit in rows like it's factories. It's an efficiency-based model. And modern management has taken almost all of its cues from the military, which was the only really large institution that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution, and then from factories. So you've got a combination of military thinking and industrial age thinking into what management is by default. And neither of those are particularly helpful for the kind of real relationship work that needs to happen, the grassroots connection that you're trying to make with people in a modern business environment. Your customers are not units and cogs in a physical factory, right? That's not who they are. Most people are probably living out of a management idea that they didn't choose themselves. And so they have to make deliberate choices themselves. Like, I'm going to be about people. People really, really matter to me. That's not obvious in a factory-based system. That's not obvious in a military-based system. You have to choose that as a manager and add it to the way that it's normally done.
I feel like in some ways, coffee is a lucky industry in that there are a lot of people who get into it for the people. Yet they will reach into the annals of management thought and will adopt unwittingly some of those very things because they say, well, now I'm a manager, now I'm a leader, I have to do these things. And it starts to become less and less about people. They try to make it more efficient via those things rather than starting with the people to be more of this higher philosophy that you're talking about through Effortless.
I just spoke to him this weekend, but I interviewed him on my podcast a while ago, is Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote a book called Trust and Inspire. And the whole idea, it's a brilliant idea. He's saying for the last 50 years, we've been saying, and we've been telling managers, you have to get out of command and control. Mm-hmm. So that language is very established. We know what we're not supposed to be doing. However, we don't have a phrase to replace it with. And so his contribution, it's not the only contribution of the book, but like his first contribution in the book is to actually provide new language from command and control to trust and inspire. I love it. And I imagine for him this future in which 50 years from now, nobody ever says command and control without saying trust and inspire, so that people have a clear idea, not just what not to do, but what to do instead. That's the focus. Can you be a trust and inspire leader? Can you trust and inspire your employees? Can you trust and inspire your customers, your partners, everybody on the team, so that people get to operate in this far more efficient way? You don't get, ironically, to this kind of efficiency through the original efficiency mindset, which was all about minimizing time off the factory floor. It wasn't about thinking. It was about how do you minimize the amount of time someone would take a break or they would be doing something else, downtime, off time, expensive time. This is not what's happening inside of our companies. It's not a good definition of efficiency. High trust environments will help create efficiency without even really asking for it.
Wow, that's powerful. And that's the return on the effort that you're talking about, that we want.
Yes.
As we wrap up here, I really want to dive into this idea that I feel like underpins the book, for me at least. And it's something I actually was telling my son the other day. I was having some strife with some of his friends. He's 10. And I said, instead of dwelling on and ruminating on, didn't use that word, but dwelling on these things, the negative things, you could dwell on what is good and listen to or find the light, like go to the light side. And then I read in your book that this is exactly what you recommend, that instead of choosing the heavy, we choose the light. And I think the quote that I have here that I just love, I hope you can expound on this, is when you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. But when you focus on what you have, you get what you lack. What's behind this? Expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, so there was an experience. I put it at the very end of the book because it's such a sacred experience for me that I really wanted the only people to read it as they were reading the book, those that continued to the end, if you see what I mean. It's a story about my daughter who went from the picture of health, voluminous in her language, energetic on the rock climbing team. I mean, really physically and mentally highly active and engaged in the world around her. So she turned 14 and she suddenly started losing, at first, motor function. So the whole right-hand side of her body stopped working, but also mentally, she lost her executive function in her brain. So that also changed her emotional range so that she went from this articulate, emotionally rich, very, very funny young girl to someone that could not answer anything without a one-word answer, right? How are you? Fine. Always fine. Never, no range at all. Took hours to eat her own meal. Took 45 seconds to write the last three letters of our name, McKeown. And this went on for months, and we're meeting with different neurologists. And I remember one who'd been in the field for 35 years just shrugging his shoulders because he said, well, all the tests have come in the normal range. I just don't know what to tell you. And, this is full circle in our conversation because this is the stuff that suffering is made of. And this is as I said before, the justification and the drive to write the book in the first place is because hopefully I'm the only person in this conversation that has had this precise challenge, but we all struggle and suffer with serious challenges. In the midst of that, we had like a eureka. And the eureka is something like this, that everything we'd been taught about gratitude was wrong. And I bet that's true for everybody that's listening to this and participating in this podcast conversation too, because what I'd been taught was that gratitude was to be thankful for the good things in your life. And that's what we think it is. That's what Thanksgiving is, right? That's what it is. But that's not what it is. That is wrong. And it's wrong definitionally. You can just look it up in a dictionary and you will find that the definition is to be grateful for the things in your life, to be grateful in life. It is not specifying the good things, the things that you just forget because, you're worried about the bad things. I think of this now, I call this now radical gratitude, even though actually it's just gratitude. Radical gratitude is to be grateful for everything. And so in the midst of the suffering, we started saying, okay, well, what can we be grateful for? Everything. And that included, now imagine how this sticks in the throat. I'm thankful that my 14-year-old vivacious daughter has an undiagnosed neurological condition or disease and is on the road to being comatose and dying, right? You don't want to say those words. But that's the act of faith that's involved. That's the genius of radical gratitude, because you open yourself to something that seems impossible at first and obviously impossible. You start to say, what if it's happening for us, not to us? What if it's happening for her, not to her? And what that did is it immediately shifted our mindset and our state immediately. We had to do this continuously. I don't mean it was a single moment and then we were forever animated by this new perspective. But as soon as we would do it, our state went from suffering into openness, possibility, a clearer discernment. We stopped doing all sorts of things that were a waste of time and that would take us down these rabbit holes. And in that better state, we could better discern, well, which neurologist should we even go after? This takes discernment. It's not just it's intellectual work that you need to be present for, but also it's emotional work, right? It's almost spiritual work where you're trying to discern where to navigate and which things are the right things to do. And so it immediately had this effect in our family. So it was mindset for me, new state for Anna and I, also for our children. So our culture was now intact. We're singing together. We're playing together. We're still, we're not in a wrecked environment. And then that led to Anna being able to say, well, I think this is the right neurologist. And it led to one thing after another. And quite rapidly, we were able to find somebody that could diagnose, had this very high listening capability that we mentioned earlier, and was able to diagnose her with encephalitis, immediate hospitalization. And that was the beginning. I mean, it was a long journey. It was a 2-year journey, but she is, as of this conversation, completely whole and well and healthy. Just went on started a church mission just recently. It's going to be 18 months in Brazil in the Amazon, and at a very low risk scenario. But none of that could have happened without radical gratitude. And so to me, that's in a sense, the deeper story and answer behind Effortless.
Wow, that is powerful. I'm so thankful to hear the story resolve in this way, but it's a courageous move to employ that kind of radical gratitude. But the fact that you opened up your interior, your world opened up as a result of that step into what probably at the time looked like a big risk, to let go of the doubt and the despair of the moment. I don't think there's anybody listening who can't identify with that, if not professionally, just personally. Like you said, we're going through a lot of things and they become magnified the longer we churn them over in our minds. And I'm really grateful for this example you've given here on the show and in the book. If I wanted to do this myself as an owner, as a leader, is this the first step, is just to get that right in your own mind, to decide to choose the light, not the heavy, to practice that gratitude and then step into these many practical steps that you outline in the book?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, you mentioned the idea that everyone can relate to this personally, which I agree with. But what about professionally? I mean, I just had a co-author of a book called A Gain in the Gap on the podcast, and that's specifically for entrepreneurs. And the idea is that when you're an achiever, the temptation is to constantly live in the distance between where you are right now and the ideal that you'd like to achieve in your business. And the problem with that isn't that it necessarily slows your progress, although I think it does. It's that you're miserable the whole time. You could be making great progress and you'd just be miserable. And then, of course, how fun is that for anyone else to be around you if you're constantly only seeing what isn't being done?
Right.
And so the idea is to shift your mindset to be in the gain. So in the gain, you're still making progress. Your ideal hasn't changed. You still know you're going to need to improve and grow and change, but you can enjoy all the progress that's been made up to this point. Now, connecting the dots between this and this broader conversation about effortless leadership, effortless living even, is that you can think of 3 concentric circles: the effortless state, then effortless action, then effortless results. And that's the structure of the book, in fact. And the reason I started with effortless state is precisely as you've named it. It's the place to begin. Think about a day or a time, not a whole day, but a time when you've been in this exhausted, frustrated, suffering state. Maybe it's just at the end of the day, you're used up, you pushed too hard, you've been red-minded too much of the day, and you can't find your keys. You get an email from somebody, it irritates you, you're so frustrated. Your daughter says, well, can you just braid my hair? That's a bother. Everything's hard. And then you contrast that with even just quite a small change. You say, okay, well, you eat a warm meal, you get a hot shower, you get a good night's sleep. And then how different does the world look? You find exactly where your keys are. Doing the hair for your child is perfectly fine, if not enjoyable experience. The email you got that you were so irritated, but you know exactly how to respond, and gracefully. It's like, oh, it's no big deal. I know where they're coming from. And that's the difference in states. And so the effortless state is the thing that you constantly need to come back to and protect. And I know of no more powerful way to produce that state than radical gratitude. It is an almost instantaneous effect, because you cannot be in a state of fear and a state of gratitude at the same time. It's not possible. It's literally not possible. And so you may get pulled back into fear afterwards, but the moment you're in radical gratitude, it completely changes your state, and therefore you can take better action and start producing these effortless results.
Man, if we're going to enter into the new year with any philosophy, it's this. And I'm really grateful for your work and your thoughtfulness in writing these things. Where can we learn more about the book and what you're doing?
Look, I think if people want to just sign up for the 1 Minute Wednesday newsletter, that's a really good place to start, because everything grows from there, right? So if people want to get opening chapter of Effortless and the opening chapter of Essentialism for free, they just go to gregmckeown.com, McKeown.com, and sign up for the 1 Minute Wednesday newsletter. It's designed to be able to read within 1 minute. Of course, it's free, but it also then connects you to the other resources, the Essentialism Academy that exists, the 21-day challenge that exists, the podcast, and so on. But it all kind of grows out of there.
Wonderful. Greg, a pleasure to have you back on the show. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and sharing all this wisdom with us.
Chris, it's been great. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I hope it got you thinking about how you can approach your work and do work that matters in a way that is easier than what you're doing right now. Of course, things are hard. Effort is needed. And how we organize our effort and what we spend our energy doing is so important. I love the concept of the 85% rule, to leave 15% in the pursuit of having margin, just in such a wise way to deal with what we know is going to come up, the unexpected things in life, the margin to respond instead of react, and to not end up frazzled and running on fumes in the pursuit of some noble cause, which indeed might be noble, but our pursuit itself in killing ourselves doing it is something that we need to reckon with. And I would encourage you to read this book and start applying some of these principles to your cafe. There are so many more practical steps and great illustrations that Greg uses in this book to drive the point home and to give you a roadmap to doing this work in your cafe, to make your work effortless. So a huge thank you to Greg McKeown for being on the show. It was great to talk with you, and thank you for your wisdom and insights here. Definitely go to gregmckeown.com and check out his books, speaking, podcast, the Academy, and sign up for the newsletter as well. Be sure to subscribe to that podcast, the Greg McKeown Podcast, and get that book, Effortless, in your hands. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about today's episode, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. I always love to hear from you in the audience of Keys to the Shop. Chris@keystotheshop.com is also where you can reach out if you want to work with me one-on-one in coaching and consulting for your coffee shop to help you and your team and your business go into the next phase of its life, to refine, to fortify, to find solutions, freedom, and joy in running a great coffee shop. Let's talk about it in a free discovery call, chris@keystotheshop.com. And with that, that is the end of our show today, everybody. I am so excited to have had Greg back on the show. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you are subscribed to the show. Go ahead and share these episodes as you feel inspired to do so. It really helps the show out a lot. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.